Hello, Matt.
Hey, Jesse. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of abolishing the police, or so we think or thought.
So you thought you were going to get into the nitty gritty of
I thought
abolishing the
so.
police, and you were, I guess, mistaken.
I was mistaken. I was taken down an alleyway by a white person, and I thought it was going to end well.
This is what you get for listening to white guys.
Well, primarily, I think the reason why I want to talk about Alex Vital's book, The End of Policing, is because it purportedly is the first full-length book that actually talks about the end of policing. And in fact, it doesn't really do that. And I'd listened to 3 podcast interviews with him from one with Doug Henwood from Behind the News, Michael Moore. Oh, these are all white guys too. Michael Moore,
You got to get out of this.
whiteness. Michael Moore's The Rumble. And then the one non-white guy, Aaron Bastani, Iranian British gentleman from very smart, very brilliant on Novara Radio, the radical socialist magazine and radio show in London. And he had interviewed him as well. And he had suggested that, especially in the Aaron Bastani interview, that it was the first, full-length book that both Verso Books had thought could be a project, and also something that he thought could be a project, which is what would the end of policing look like. And in all of the interviews, I was like, he doesn't really get that much into the steps or process points of how you'd end the police. So, man, I really have to read this book.
Uh-huh.
And you seem to have known more because you actually skimmed it when it was free download on versobooks.com.
Well, and I was familiar with this other book because actually I was recalling this other book that is on this topic. It was this book, Our Enemies in Blue, which I believe I had sold at
Christian Williams, Williamson or Christian Williams?
Christian Williams.
From AK Press.
So this book was originally published in 2004 and was updated to a second edition in 2014, I think. But it was published in 2004, and I sold a lot of AK Press books at the shop box in Bellingham, and I recognize it. So I'm pretty sure I had the book there. But I would recommend getting this book as well if you want. But it's pretty much the same thing. It's the same structure. It's the same. It's almost the same book. Alex Vitale does quote him like twice.
Insights in the end notes. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, one of the best parts of Alex Vitale's book is the suggested reading list at the end.
Yeah.
Because it's on to more stuff. So it's like introduces you to the overall project of the book, sort of introduces you to things.
I would call the book The End of Policing a collage work of scholarship. So it's a collage. So there's books that you read where there's no really tremendously original insights, but it cobbles together lots of other insights from other books. So it's an amalgamation of other great thoughts and research from scholarly or mainstream publications. And so it's a collage work of scholarship, or what we just call collage scholarship. It's not really advancing any new ideas that I could see, other than putting together in a pastiche-like way all of the ideas cited from other books.
And I'm all for collage.
Absolutely.
Part of my practice too, as an artist, or supposed to be part of my practice, was when I used to make art. But I also shared with you a couple things that right now there's this weekend that we're recording this, is that because you mentioned collage, so there's 2 collage pieces, and I shared with you the Arthur Jaffa piece, the
Love is the Message is Death.
Yeah, Arthur Jaffa's piece, Love is the Message is Death, streaming for a limited time.
Till the 28th, I think it said. So we could put in the show notes, maybe they'll extend it, but it's a very short period.
Yeah, that because I saw that, and I was telling you I saw that in Chicago last year in its installation form, which is really great. But also, speaking of a sort of collage book by a white person, is this other piece that I thought was a really great film. I thought was one of the better things that I saw last year, which was the piece Marshawn Lynch, A History, which is a feature-length collage film by the author David Shields, the writer, and sort of loosely taking the ideas that he had sort of set forth first in his book from the 90s, Fear of a Black Planet, that was looking at a season of Seattle Supersonics. He teaches at...
Yeah, he's a gay white writer from the Seattle Pacific Northwest area. I think I'm pretty sure I remember him visiting my class with Carol Gass at Western Washington University. But that was prior to these publications, so it was back in the 1990s.
Have you seen this Marshawn Lynch?
No, I haven't. I remember you about 2 years ago, you highly recommended it.
Well, last year.
Yeah, last year. Yeah.
I highly recommend that, just on the topic of collage work. But anyways, back to Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing. So the couple of things I want to say off the top about it, just observations. One, the title and the cover design, I think, are playing part of like it sort of taking off at the moment, in addition to it being, it was published in 2017, and now in this moment of uprising.
It's had over 200,000 downloads from what I had last heard, and it's been out of print. It goes out of print as soon as Versa Books puts it up. So on June 17th, it was back on the store and then sold out. And then hysterically enough, I was trying to get a hard copy because I prefer that when I'm reading. And I found out AK Press has a copy just sitting at AK Press that I could get a paper-based version. But fundamentally, it's gotten a lot of attention. Alex Vitale's done a lot of interviews. A lot of mainstream press is even talking to him. But once again, I was led down the path to think that this was actually a book about abolishment.
From him being more prominent, Alex Vitale, in this moment, and his work beyond the book, I wouldn't say that he's not an abolitionist. I think he's
no. He definitely says he is, and once again, he does the work. He goes to 35. He's been to 35 cities in the last year, so he's doing the work for abolition and works and often lifts up other voices in the movement. But I was expecting the book to be more concrete, more full of flowers.
Yeah, no, I saw the book as more a letter to liberals, right? That it was that what he was doing with the book was trying to do some myth busting, using the work of many people before him and drawing upon that in a collage kind of way, like you said, but gathering together, not all, but a good chunk of evidence in a way, and putting together in a way that was palatable to liberals, so that the ideas that would lead towards abolitionist thought could be presented to a largely liberal audience.
Yeah, and this is what he says in an interview with Doug Henwood in Behind the News. If you're going to build a coalition, you want to go to the person that's closest to you, that you can move over to the fence.
Right.
Fence sitters, political window watchers, liberals who are very invested in the idea that we can reform the system. And it became quite clear that it is really crafted towards liberals, because it never uses the word socialism. Doesn't use the word abolish even. I don't even think it says that.
I mean, I searched the book for the word. It's like in there maybe once or twice, and it's never a statement to abolish the police.
Yes, it never says we need a socialist or utopian horizon. Doesn't say abolishment. It critiques reform quite mightily, as well as the myths around it. And in the very beginning of the book, it goes through all the myths, what you call the 5 myths that are in the book.
If we return to Christian Williams' book really quick, there's a couple of things I pulled from there that sort of encapsulate that book, and then also present in Alex Vitale's, but sort of tempered a little bit for liberals, right? Because remember, the Christian Williams book was AK Press, it was by the Anarchist Book Press, and he opens up the book by saying, "What are police for? Everybody thinks they know, but to assume that the police exist to enforce the law or fight crime is akin to beginning an analysis of military policy with the premise that armies exist to repel invasions. The ends an institution pursues are not always the same as those it claims to pursue." So basically, they say they were for one thing and they're for something else. And so the whole body of the book is breaking down those myths, setting them up and knocking them down. And it concludes the book in much the same way that Alex Vitale concludes his, with a wrapping up sort of a set of recommendations in this sort of very prescriptive methodology that is the framework for almost every bit of academic sort of writing. It seems is like, let's diagram the corpse, we'll detail the disaster in a very detailed way, and at the end we'll throw some
like 5%, because the conclusion is like literally 10 pages.
We'll do 5% or 2% or 1% towards solutions. It's sort of like the 1% for art sort of framework.
It's synonymous. It's synonymous with the failure of science fiction as a genre in terms of literary forms. And there's been several articles I've cited and talked about in prior podcasts about the end of Imagineering in science fiction, that it can only write dystopian, terminal dystopian syndrome kind of things, where it's just constantly diagramming the corpse and not doing the real courageous and inventive and imaginative work, which is developing utopian horizon. And this is like Naomi Klein we've talked about. We've talked about with Mike Davis
hey, but Alex Vitale's gotten what 15,000 more followers on Twitter, so it works. This is the path to legitimacy and success and embrace by the technocratic liberal elite. So good on you. But anyways, Christian Williams' book, there's one quote that I pull from there that sort of summarizes the whole sort of body of the book, which is that control of the lower classes has been a function of policing at every point since the institution's birth, and has served as one of the major determinants of its development. Right? It's always for controlling poor people and racialized folks. So he concludes, and his conclusion is, his principal recommendation then, we must recognize the possibility of a world without police. Doesn't that sound...
Hashtag that shit. Hashtag it.
Oh, speaking of hashtag defund NYPD. So if you've been paying attention to, we're seeing the latest iteration of Occupy tactics going on in New York City, just a few blocks from Zuccotti Park over at the City Hall.
And some of the people that are involved with Defund NYPD were involved with Occupy as well. So we can move towards demand-based claims and looking at $1 billion defunding. And once again, that's actually a fairly small amount given how much the NYPD gets in terms of the budget.
The demand...
It's scalable.
Right. The demand is... this is an interesting sort of development, right? That there's using the tactics of Occupy, but with a concrete, specific demand of... We're going to occupy in the park around City Hall until we defund the police. We take $1 billion out of the $6 billion of funding for police.
Yeah, and this is a step up. This is a step up from Occupy, which Mike Davis's a critical claim of the Occupy, as well as Smucker's book, Hegemony, How-To, Rules for Radicals. They both diagram how they didn't actually have demands. It was a grievance-based movement that was, in some sense, refusing to actually want or to make demands on the state or on the authority body. So you remember the demands to defund is already better than Occupy, which couldn't even come up with a list that was functional, that was organized, that was clear. And this was Occupy Riverside. We never were able to come up with a list of demands because we couldn't agree on what the demands were. So that's one step up.
Well, the one takeaway was to a consensus around the observation that we are the 99%.
Yeah.
So
and if you look at Ferguson and Black Lives Matter 2014, 2016, that the demands were like two basic things, which is say Black Lives Matter. Right. Get the ruling elite to identify that Black Lives Matter and then put a bunch of cameras on cops. That was like the two big things. So this is a huge evolution in terms of demands because it's going straight to the funding mechanism that perpetuates itself, which is if you can defund the police, that means they have less money to organize and campaign and lobby against defunding and also to expand what they currently have. So that's a big deal. So we have to look at how these movements are building off each other. And we know, of course, Minneapolis did have the cameras. There was meditation and bias trainings and those sorts of things and diversifying of the police force. So these reforms didn't work in Minneapolis and they haven't worked in areas as well. So I think going to see these demands made where it's going to defunding is a vast improvement.
Well, and I'm excited by the progression of the demand towards the Golden Square.
Yeah,
like absolutely. It's getting closer and closer. So we're seeing, again, like we mentioned before, you observed seeing a lot of 3 out of those 4 as part of this demands, not as a total revolution in the way that we conceptualize the social arrangements, right? Because the way that I would advocate for is that thinking of basic provisions as the bare minimum basis of the social
non-negotiable
parts of the social contract.
Yeah.
We're going to write a social contract. How do we live together? Well, first and foremost, we make sure that everybody has a dignified life by providing food, shelter, healthcare, and education. And we start there, and that has to be the bare minimum. So that isn't the demand, right? The demand is like, well, let's fund programs that go towards those things. Like people know that these are the things. So we're sort of seeing bits and pieces of it sort of more and more clearly be articulated. It is even articulated in Alex Vitale's book. He does
definitely. Oh, definitely. So if you look at school to prison pipeline, you're dealing with one aspect of the Golden Square, which is Chapter 3, school to prison pipeline. What is needed but often not supplied by school officials is a set of non-punitive disciplinary measures designed to keep kids in school while getting to the root of disruptive behavior. Schools cannot solve all the problems students bring in, but they can be the part of the solution rather than part of the criminal justice system. To do that, they need more resources to deal with the whole student, whole student learning, right? And, and then again, when you're talking about, so that's education, right? So this is where something that should be well-funded, non-negotiable, is being criminalized. So we're criminalizing the Golden Square. And then Chapter 4, we called for help. They killed my son, deals a lot with mental health, right? Which is Medicare for all, right? If you want an anti-racist project, you need to decommodify these basic necessities, these basic rights. And so once again, this is a cannibalization of the healthcare, right? So instead of getting mental health officials or an ambulance to come to help your child, you have to call the cops because you don't have healthcare. And then with Chapter 5, it's shelter, number 2 of the Golden Square, which is homelessness, which is an ethnic group created and manufactured by capital rule. And once again, criminalizing rather than solving, right? So criminalizing what you didn't solve in the first place.
Well, I mean, this is
right for housing.
This is the more clear understanding of the function of the police, and more the function of the police as detailed. It's carefully detailed in this book, and like we said, others, that they're the catch-all solution. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor mentioned multiple times too recently, like the police are the catch-all solution to social problems. So homelessness is a problem, it's in the police. So criminalize everything. And this should be like, this is the ruling elite sort of approach to problem solving, is let's just criminalize and punish. And we say we need to democratize and decommodify.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to decommodify bodies while we decommodify the land. We have to free the land as well as free ourselves. And so those are aspects of where the Golden Square touches, which essentially, instead of solving and providing fundamental rights, not access, fundamental rights to the Golden Square, we criminalize the effects of our inability as a state to provide those resources, those rights. And then the Chapter 6 and 7 is the failures of policing sex work, the war on drugs. These are not necessarily tied with the Golden Square, but these certainly deal with notions of belonging, affection, pleasure, and don't conveniently fit in there. And I wonder what you make of that, which is, why are these criminalized if these are not punitive measures to prevent the actual deployment of the Golden Square? What do you make of these two chapters?
The provision of basic needs, or as we frame it, the Golden Square, is not a starting point for anybody's conversation. So it's certainly not the starting point, and certainly not for Alex Vitale's book. But what he's doing is diagramming, like we said, diagramming and sort of myth busting. What he's done recently is, in Washington Post, already published a piece that took what in the book are 10 chapters of sort of main myths that liberals believe about the police, like why the police exist, and sort of bust those down. And he's more recently condensed it into 5 myths. So he's published an opinion piece that's the 5 myths about the police. So in the short version, the 5, it's myth number 1 is police spend most of their time fighting crime. Fucking bullshit. They spend most of their time sitting around waiting to trap people so that they can have an excuse to beat them up.
Well, there's a great quote in the first chapter. He says he's interviewing on a cop on their tour of duty, whatever you want to call it, and they say the cop tells him it's 99% boredom, 1% terror.
Exactly. Yeah. Sit around until it's time to fucking beat somebody up.
How much of that violence is out of that 99% of boredom, the rage at having a bullshit job? Because this is a bullshit job.
It's a total bullshit job, yeah.
So how much of that rage and that punitive aspects of wailing on people, especially folks of color, indigenous, undocumented folks, mentally ill, how much of that is just their boredom versus the institution itself that relies, extends, and wants to monitor the working class and folks of color?
Well, you saw that story this week of, I forget off the top of my head what city this was in, but the dash cam recording of a couple cops sitting in their car, one just idle 99% time, and just having a total racist.
Oh, we're going to go kill all of them, all these black
Yeah.
people, right? They literally said, "I would kill all these black people." And this is the thing is, what if we just reframe the conversation instead of a few bad apples, we say maybe there's just only a few good apples in the whole system, and that maybe that's something we can address it, because these videos. I mean, I'll post this in the show notes, but there's the Amnesty International says there's been 125 human rights violations by cops across the country over these George Floyd protests, right? These uprisings. And 125, I was thinking to myself, wow, they have this interactive graph, which I'll post, which is really great. But it's like every time a gun goes off and hits someone in the leg, that's already a violation. So it's violations within violations. So is it really 125 or more like 15,000 or 1,500? Because every time these impact bullets go off, 35, 37 millimeter impact bullets, like the one in Minneapolis where they're shooting people on their porch. How much of that is really like individual events versus individual actions? And then we get an astronomical sense of like, it's just maybe a few good apples, because I shared a meme that was very funny that says, "Oh, here's all the good cops that reported on police abuse lost their jobs."
So why the fuck would you want to be a cop in the first place?
Mm-hmm. I think some of it. So there's a claim you can make, which is number one, if you can't get into an expense. This is something David Graeber said about the military, which might be true with the police. Is people want a life of nobility? They want to do things that they think are honorable. Yeah. And so this is one of the path of good intentions. Exactly. The path of good intentions is that, I want to protect the flag. I want to protect my culture, whatever that is. We might be white supremacists in most cases, but you want to protect the flag, protect your culture, protect tradition, protect the American way. I can't get into the Ivy League school, but I can go into the police, which is less expensive, requires less training. And I was already in the military anyway. So this will be a life of nobility. I want to be loved. And then I become down to the fact that I want to be loved. And this is a fucking horrible way to be loved, rather than serving or healing your community, is this myth that you go into, which is that you're going to protect people.
Just go up and beat everybody up. That's a good way.
I love you so much. Here's the baton. Oh my God, did your thigh muscle get torn? That was my bullet of love. Yeah, but I think there's an aspect of like wanting nobility. David Graeber, the anthropologist, talks about this, is that, in areas that are very rural, that don't have, capital or don't have major universities, these are the only seemingly honorable occupations that isn't, bored to the death barista jobs or working at Walmart, that has some level of honor,
meaning and purpose. And all,
it actually addresses this desire for purpose, and that we haven't created jobs that do that. I mean, especially if they're poorly paid. I mean, why not be a hospice worker? But you're not celebrated. You're not acknowledged. You're given savagely low wages. That's an honorable job. That's a job of nobility. But because it's associated with death and the elderly, it's considered a backwater job. So some of that's going on.
Right. And what books like this book are doing is diagramming how more and more ruling elite have offered no other solution, no other opportunity for folks to engage in meaningful work to help their community except through policing, right? Because policing becomes the solution for everything. Policing is the way you address every single problem. Mm-hmm. I want to get back to the content of the book. But before we digress there for a few minutes, however long that was, I was mentioning his most recent article, right? This 5 myths. So I mentioned the first one was police spend most of their time fighting crime. Fucking bullshit. Yep. One, not only is it like you said, 99% boredom and 1% terror. The real criminals, the real theft of value, which is the job of capitalism, there's never any sort of accountability for that, as we know. So
yeah, look at George Floyd. He allegedly had a fake $20 bill, right? So immediately criminalized, and the worker at the store was basically deputized, to use the phrase that Ruthie Gilmore Wilson says, that deputized to actually call the cops rather than deal with it afterwards. But if you look at wage slavery, the actual stealing of theft of wages on one level, and then the actual theft of theft, the wages that you're already exploited for, and which are basically hidden in terms of hourly pay, that's a civil offense. It's not a criminal offense. So
Yeah.
when it comes to white collar crime or crimes by the corporate state, by Walmart or Pizza Hut with stolen wages, I mean, I had a friend that worked at Pizza Hut, and he was pretty certain that their hours were being changed when they're getting their paychecks because the manager was compelled to keep labor pay low for hourly pay because they wanted to protect their profit margins and quarterly.
Wait, isn't that the story about every capital?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
There's national
that is the golden rule.
wage. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there's the wage slavery, which your surplus labor is stolen from you. But on top of that, white collar crime, as well as crimes by the corporate state, by these monopolies, they're civil offenses. Nobody goes to jail for this, right? Where George Floyd gets the neck, he gets to the neck.
Yeah, and remember that those quote unquote white collar crimes, there's only certain offenses that are even considered crimes, and again, Ruth Gilmore talks about this, the law, and how the shaping of the law too is a part of the neoliberal project is creating the conditions under which it's legal to do things that are outright.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is what's going
violations.
On. This is once again why the history of the police cannot be erased or remanaged in any meaningful sense, because we have hundreds of years of history where it basically is a buffer to prevent paradigm shifts in power and wages and labor, and to control the inequalities. John Stewart, who's a liberal, at least gets it quite well. He calls it like they're patrolling the invisible border between the have and have-nots, right? They're the borderland workers.
So they're drawing a thin blue line between
the only difference between the police and fucking military is saran wrap, right? It's like tinted saran wrap. And if you look at the history of the U.S. as a global force, gets training from places like Israel, like the Israeli police force, because they have very advanced ideas of counterinsurgency. We train Vietnamese, quote unquote, South Vietnamese army on our insurgency techniques. The war in the Philippines was the basis for some of the start of these police patrols, these police forms. The state police in Pennsylvania was the first state police body, and they worked from and borrowed from tools on insurgencies to controlling the Filipino population during the colonization process. So there is just a saran wrap layer between the military and the police, and this is the real bait and switch: is that we somehow think they operate differently. They are a surveillance system. Yeah. They surveil every liberation struggle in American history. Yeah. There is no liberation struggle in America, whether it's CORE, CDC, the anti-war movement, whether it's SDS, Students for Democratic Society, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement, NAACP. It's always surveilling liberation movements. It's never not done that. Right. And so I think we should just think of this as an extension of the colonized project. And this is something that's talked about in the Black Agenda Report, which is that African-American communities, Black communities, are fundamentally colonized subjects in the domestic sphere, right? Yeah. That these are colony states. And someone might say we have third worlds inside the first world, or first worlds inside the third world when it comes to the United States. And so this idea that the military is somehow different than the police. No, it's an outgrowth. It mimics all the aspects of it uses the military as its kind of Disney Imagineering studio. So all the really great innovations come from the military and then are adopted either in terms of equipment, in terms of, the FBI, right? The Council Poirot does all this stuff where they basically monitor tap wires, control phone messages, analyze text. It's being modeled from the military.
Right. It's just military is the testing grounds. Let's test out all of these modes of violence and control outside the borders, and then those most effective will bring inside.
That's why it's just tinted saran wrap. That's the only difference. And once again, you could say, "Oh, you're not being nuanced enough." But if you look at the repeated infractions of history with the police, it's that they're mimicking and mirroring these innovations of counterinsurgency. Whether it's the Vietnamese, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Japan, and especially starting with the Philippines. And once again, the basis of the London Metropolitan Police starts with both one to destroy and control the Irish, right? And then also to control and establish power over India, right? So the subcontinent. And so these are the basis for how they mirror these subjects and these positions. So it's a saran wrap.
Well, there are two things that are missing from Alex Vitale's book, again, because it's see it as a letter to liberals, sort of open the door timidly towards abolitionist thought. But there are two things that are necessary components to an abolitionist approach. One is internationalism. Right? This is not just an American project, right? Abolition of policing is not just something that needs to happen in America. This is something that, again, the whole prison, industrial, military, state violence complex, right? So it needs to be international, and it needs to be anti-capitalist. There's no way that these projects can be really undertaken, and we can be effective without the framing of both an internationalist and anti-capitalist. And the fact that there's no anti-capitalist sort of, there's only the sort of brief windows to like the mention of economic justice and so forth, like in Alex Vitale's book, but it's not rooted in an anti-capitalist position. And an anti-capitalist critique is one of its big failures.
I think it's one of its big failures because you could aim it at liberals, but then end with communism, right? You can, claim towards decommodification, a claim towards, it doesn't talk about community land trust, doesn't talk about worker cooperatives, doesn't talk about building community wealth, which is at the heart of
doesn't talk about dual power
redistribution down below, right? And so that's the problem is if you're a liberal reading this book, would you even pick it up? Because it's called The End of Policing. Would liberals read that book? I mean, it sounds radical on the outside, but it's more hollow on the inside.
I think that's part of its approach, though, is that it's, and his accompanying essay around the time the book was out in Jacobin, it was called "The Police and the Liberal Fantasy," basically summarizing the argument in the book. But he does point it a little bit more squarely towards a sort of socialist project in a socialist magazine. I think it's just that the book itself is this sort of contained, presentable package for liberals. So if you want to send a book to your liberal boss or friends or colleagues or coworkers who you may not have had discussions about abolition or may not be always open to revolutionary ideas, maybe this is one that will be like, one, shocking on its face. The cover, it's The End of Policing, but takes them carefully, slowly, with a white academic through this.
Yeah, they holds her hands through the process of
decommodification. I continually was reminded of this bit at the end of an episode of John Oliver's show late last year. He had an episode that was looking at bias in medicine, and especially
Wanda Sykes? Was this with Wanda Sykes?
He brought in Wanda Sykes at the end, and Wanda Sykes did this thing of like, bring a white man. Go to if you want the doctor to listen to you, bring a white man. And so they had all these clips of Larry David just repeating things. So
injuries, my backache, my ankle,
we don't believe black women, have a white man say the thing and I'll say it. And then all of a sudden everybody will. So that's
like a talking puppet. What do you call this?
A ventriloquist.
Ventriloquist, yeah. So he's the white person's ventriloquist. It might be coming from Black Thought, Black Voice, but it's got a white person that's mimicking it. So use whiteness as a ventriloquist kind of technique. And there's a claim to that, which is Alex Vitale might make this more palatable to people that otherwise wouldn't read these things. From a black nationalist or from a communist or from an anti-capitalist or a member of the Black Lives Matter movement. Because he is being interviewed by all of the liberal establishment, other than what he's notably said was, NPR. He's been interviewed by MSNBC, in fact. So there's a limit to how far you can go with liberals in terms of their blinders. But I just think, did people actually pick up the book when it first came out? I don't think so, because if it was aimed at liberals, number one, it was in a radical publication called Verso Books. It wasn't published in a kind of liberal, wasn't Random House, It was published within a radical press because of the title. And the title seems like it was a gotcha question, which, you could think about how it would have been framed, but it's working now in terms of talking to liberals. I mean, because of 2020. And that's what's interesting. His claims in the interviews are more radical than the book. That's what's interesting.
Good, which is good. I think, look, we can critique, and it's not like I'm much more interested in all the other work that's been done by activists in the movement. I mean, I think there's other books on abolition and this topic, like a book published by the same press, by Verso Press, that was also a free download recently that you can get from their website for just a few bucks for the ebook right now, Policing the Planet. And it's a collection of essays and interviews and such for instance, there's one interview with Patrisse Cullors, one of the 3 Black women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement, where she talks about abolition, and it's a short little interview, makes concise argument, all the same things about observation of the police in its history always being for the control by the ruling elite of poor working class racialized people, and that the project needs to be one of abolition, and it needs to be internationalist, and it needs to be anti-capitalist. But so there are many sources that will take beyond
once again, we'll put in the show notes the 8 to Abolition, which is clearly marking out either chronological steps or parallel steps that could be formed in terms of defunding the police, right? And this is the other thing we've talked about in the prior episodes, is the path to defunding the police is just one part of abolishing the police. And when we defund the police, we control the amount of money they have to lobby the state, to lobby the federal government, to lobby city councils, which are the 2 biggest suppliers of money to the city councils are land developers and the correctional and police unions. So that combined carceral state funding is powerful. And the other aspect of that, and we'll link the article about unions from The Guardian about police unions, which is there's 2 methods at which they both control and advance their horizon, which is one, they just lobby the shit out of the political function of the government, the local government. And then also they use the framework of soft on crime, which it really became almost like a huge hard-on for every politician in the 1990s. So from 1990s on up, 3 strikes law, the Bill Clinton incarceration and punitive aspects is soft on crime, right? And this starts with LBJ with he wrote a foreword to a book about the Texas Rangers, right, and their expropriation of indigenous territory and Mexican American land in Texas. But that, LBJ kind of started this in 68, right, signing the Voting Rights Act of 64, but at the same time, advancing the police and advancing the reform movement, because the reform movement even starts in the 60s, right? So it's not like this reform movement is something that's just happened as a result of Ferguson or the 1990s of the Bill Clinton. It's part of a larger project of always trying to co-opt the left horizon so that they fundamentally can further dig in terms of power. And so that's why the soft on crime thing is consistent. But when we have the violence at a much larger level than even Occupy, and then we have this soft on crime and this lobbying, if we can defund, we can control the amount of money to perpetuate themselves.
The pressure from police unions as part of a whole push towards becoming more hard on crime, who's tougher on crime, and out tough, who's going to be the toughest on crime? Bill Clinton is going to be the toughest on crime. That whole
eat push. People on stage.
I mean, I think
it's falling flat. It doesn't work anymore.
And Ava DuVernay's film The 13th is a good piece on following that history, that trajectory of the especially Democratic Party on this ramping up of how tough can you be on crime.
It's a framework that's invested in the right-left spectrum of what's called the Republican and Democratic Party, because George Lakoff has a book about this, about elephants and donkeys. I can't remember the title of it, but basically that the Republican Party's framework is that of the strict daddy. So the framing metaphor for the Republican Party has been that we're going to be the strict daddy, and the role of the state is to be the strict father. Now, the power of Wall Street,
Fuck your patriarchy.
Well, that's the framework of George Lakoff's kind of framing. And the Democratic Party pretends to be what George Lakoff calls the nurturing co-parents, right? That they're going to do preventative, healing basing, but that's not what they're doing. They've actually folded into the Republican Party in terms of the strict fathers, the strict daddy. And this is what these reform policies are about, is reforming the strict father to make the strict father more logical in terms of their abuse.
That's a good point. As we sort of wrap up on time, there are a couple of things I wanted to get into the chat here that I wanted to just mention. One was, we talked about last week the PMC, the professional managerial class,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
As a sort of the liberal elite, the professional managerial classes being the folks that are in the way.
Mhm.
We have a set of demands that are about our material reality and about moving towards a cooperative basis for the structure of society. But the professional managerial class is highly entrenched in and invested in protecting their own
I
status
mean, on
and
one side, yes, because the PMC we see on Twitter, I mean, Twitter is basically the palace for the professional management class. So you're
yeah,
either a celebrity or you're some journalist that makes very good wages and everybody,
yeah.
throws bombs at you. So it's the PMC palace. Whereas like, weirdly at Facebook is much more democratic as a model. But I don't want to treat the PMC as a monolith because it's
No, they're not.
fracturing. Obviously, if you
Yeah.
look at adjunct teachers, if you look at nurses that are increasingly turned into technicians, there's an internal division within the PMC class.
But this text, Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing, as a letter to liberals,
Mhm, mhm,
as a diagram for the technocrats, as
mhm,
a doorway for professional managerial class to
mhm,
live up to what they profess on Twitter and
mhm.
elsewhere of like, we stand with Black Lives, a message, again, this whole message from our CEO. Like, this is important work, I think.
Yeah,
Right.
because
So we can
want
critique
liberals
it.
to just I don't want liberals to use the summer to just form book clubs.
Right.
I think that's the thing that's disconcerting is I've heard several fellow teachers saying, I'm going to form a book club, which, how to aid and be an ally and all this. But I'm like, well, actually, that's cool and stuff. It's great. It can influence your teaching. But are you actually joining these existing movements right now and
Right.
helping to advance
Are
material claims?
are there any radicals in your book club? Because if you think you're going the whole distance by reading The End of Policing, even as radical as it might seem on the face to you, you're only scratching the surface.
Or if you're going back to your comfort blanket and just
Yeah.
talking about racism as some phantasm, so let's
Yeah.
just become more aware of racism and you're doing the reformist politics, which is asking the police to do meditation retreats on racism rather than to actually materially change the notion of power in our society.
But I mean, I'm hoping that in this moment, in this year of compounding catastrophes, that there are some folks that are actually doing that hard work of evaluating and changing their position, their mind, and hopefully, therefore, then their actions that they take in the day-to-day lives, right? Because these things connect to decisions that are made every day, especially in working environments. And especially in the upcoming months when eviction moratoriums are going to end and people are going to run out of unemployment insurance benefits and the well-funded institutions are going to move in strongly into a period of austerity. All of those decisions that these managers and administrators and people in positions of power are going to be making, like, it's super critical that there's a
Mhm.
radical voice
Oh,
that's
yeah.
like pushing
And
them to like,
and this is to say too that within the defund movement, there's nuance, complication, and complexity in the movement. So, like I'll
yeah,
reference in the show notes an article that I just read today called "Community Control versus Defunding the Police: A Critical Analysis" by Max Rameau and Nefta Freeman in the great magazine and online journalistic outfit, the Black Agenda Report. It outlines the fact that defund alone won't create the abolishment of the police because their theory is that it started out as a private police force with slave patrols and basically mining powers in the South, wanting to develop something beyond the Pinkertons where they could actually get the taxpayer to do this, that there is a private force in this, and that we could think of community policing as a failure, but we could also talk about community control, a community board that they talk about in the interview from This Is Hell podcast about having a community control board of the police where they can actually hire and fire, as well as have people that are not elected but are drawn from the community at large through a sortition process, a lottery basically of random folks from the community that represent the community in whole rather than
yeah.
get co-opted by the election process. And so this is something to think about because if we think about just abolishing the police, that's one thing, but will the private police return if we totally abolish them? Should we just take them over? If we're going to keep some vestiges of the police, is it that we take them over so much so fast that we don't even use the word police. It just becomes something else. And I think that's more of the end stage conversation about what happens after we defund, because Max Rameau and Nefta Freeman both do agree with the general first wave impetus to narrow the budget of the police, but they will remind you that we'll just go back to the 1960s. They weren't good to blacks back then either, or folks of color. That you could make them smaller in your city governance or state budgets, but it's not going to eliminate the lack of accountability. It's not going to eliminate what Ruth Wilson calls the lawfare. The lawfare upholds the warfare, and the lawfare has to be attacked as well, which is that we can't have this near immunity for police anymore. We can't have these fraternized relationships between the prosecuting attorney and the police. We need to have separate bodies and organizations that aren't an oversight board, but actually where they can hire and fire at will using community control. And so I think there's nuance and dynamism in terms of what the defund movement means.
Yeah, nuance, dynamism. It's not a straightforward line from police exist now and we take away the money and then they don't exist. That's not, and it's not even just as simple as the tentpole sort of demands of defund, disarm, dismantle, because one of the things that you may have seen floating around a lot was the story of Camden, New Jersey, and where they dissolved their police department, and that's not necessarily a success, because then they later built it back up. So you can fire all the existing cops and then you can start over, which presumably might be what we'll see happen and play out in Minneapolis. This sort of like, well, let's get rid of all of this current batch, and then we'll just start over. We
can imagine this as a larger revolutionary claim, because as Rosa Luxemburg writes, that colonialism is always part of capitalism, right? So we have the internalization of the police as specters of the military, that clean, small saran wrap that wraps them up. But that there's been protests over the world, all over the world, over racism and over the police. It's not just racism, but just the police itself. And that in Germany and Sweden and other countries, as Angela Davis says, these are the largest global protests against the police on a global level, which connects, I think it can scale up to conversations about the U.S. empire and the U.S. military, which is mimicking, is basically the innovation center for American police. And our police are in other countries.
Yeah, you need to fucking abolish America.
Yes.
Like literally, there's no, it's an indefensible, there was a lot of high profile intellectuals. I think I remember specifically Michael Moore and Cornel West, right as the uprisings were beginning, saying this is proof that America is a failed social experiment or a failed state, And it's always been a fucking shit show. It's always been horrible.
It's failed for the 99% or the 80% if you want to be more accurate, but it's been incredibly successful for the wealthy, right? It's done all of what it's intended to do. And so I think you're right. If we don't take an international component on this, we're not going to get this wider conversation about empire and colonialism, and that the end of the United States would mean the end of empire. It would mean the end of the military. And that's the history of the United States, was like, we don't want Britain to control our empire building. We want to actually control our own empire building. And that's really the founding of the United States.
And abolish America as a key part of abolishing nation states altogether, abolishing borders altogether. So don't think of it as a narrowly nationalist.
And it goes both ways. Like the U.S. provides military training to other countries, right? So it's a network. It's an interlaced network. And the fact that the academies are controlled by former military officials, that's a kind of road warrior mentality in terms of being in their car and shooting people on spot. It needs to be part of an international left to use the police as an example of what is much larger project of racialized capitalism, which is find a natural site of the earth and colonize it and commodify it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully what we're witnessing, what we're all living through, hopefully participating in, pushing forward this year, is just a part of a long road, and maybe a push that much closer to revolution so that we can get from this era of what some have called capitalist realism or capitalist catastrophism, as we've read somebody trying to pitch.
Well, we should celebrate also the accomplishments we're already seeing and work from them. Say we're winning stuff more than Bernie Sanders, more than Occupy, more than the anti-war movement. We're seeing policies change in city offices across the country. And we'll put a graph on the show notes about what's been actually won across the country. This is the most successful movement I've been involved with. I wasn't involved with the WTO protests, which I think were the last ones that had material effects. Like they basically diminished the power of the WTO and basically obliterated its ability to do what it wanted to do. So it was successful in that vein. I mean, so from 1999 to this is where we're seeing material change happen. So we should celebrate, we should demand, we should dismantle, and we should disarm.
Yeah. We move from this era to an era of truth, reckoning, reparations, and real revolutionary transformations. So maybe we can
transformation of our idea.
Move on to those ideas next week. How about that?
Yeah, we'll talk about the other police state, our money.
All right. Good to
take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Cheers.